as was mentioned, adaptation is about how we can equip our communities, residents and businesses to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change that are now unavoidable. What you can see on this slide in the call out at the bottom are some bits of the vision statement that we put together through earlier consultation on this plan. And those will be the guiding statements as we finish the development of the plan and move forward into implementation. Next slide, please. All right. So we have been working with ICLEI Canada to develop this climate change impact adaptation plan through their BARC, or Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities framework. This is a 5-milestone plan that begins with stakeholder research and project planning at the outset and ends with monitoring and review of the plan after implementation. It's an iterative plan, meaning that we will continue to revise and update it as time goes by and new information becomes available. We're currently on milestone 3. We're currently actually closer to the end of milestone 3 as we are getting close to having an implementation schedule and an action plan there. And some recent deliverables have been the Science of Climate Change report and the Vulnerability and Risk Assessment that I will be talking about in a little bit. Next slide, please. All right. A little bit about engagement. So we used a lot of engagement to develop this plan, both internally and externally. Internally, we had a core project team that had representation from all city departments, and that team met monthly. We also had 6 external mini workshops for the vulnerability and risk assessment, as well as internal and external surveys, workshops for developing and validating actions, one-on-one meetings were requested, the Engage site that Sue has already discussed. And as a result of this very intensive organization or engagement, we've had 26 social organizations, 13 industrial, commercial, and institutional organizations, and 8 environmental organizations participate, creating a very full and complete plan that reflects all of the concerns that the community has, or so we hope. Anyways, next slide. So one of the reasons why we did this kind of engagement is because of equity concerns. As I'm sure many of the folks on the call are aware, climate change does not affect everyone equally. While no one is immune to the impact of climate change, and we will all be affected to some extent, some people, depending on their place in society, will be more affected than others. So in order to deal with the equity side of these impacts, we conducted an extensive literature review looking for which demographic groups would be predominantly affected by climate change, and did a stakeholder assessment of which organizations in the Hamilton community could best speak to the needs of those communities, of those demographic groups. We then had a very flexible and accommodating engagement strategy, recognizing that, you know, our community organizations have been as affected by climate change or more so, or sorry, by COVID as anybody else, and that resources, time, and staff availability are very strapped. So, you know, we had meetings anytime that they could be available and changed engagement where needed in order to accommodate them to the extent possible. The photograph here was taken actually from the New York Times, and it shows the results of a hurricane after it hit New York City last summer. The hurricane didn't actually, it was no longer a hurricane by the time it hit the city, but it still caused extensive flooding, and that flooding led to the deaths of 11 people who drowned in their basement apartments. The majority of those people were undocumented immigrants who simply couldn't afford better or safer housing. This is someone whose own home was flooded, but who managed to survive. And you can see the damage to the housing that he experienced as a result of that flood, as well as, you know, how high the water level got while he was inside. Now, of course, we're not a coastal city, so we're not expecting hurricanes and flooding to that extent, but we do see basement flooding in the city of Hamilton, as I'm sure many of you know, and it does affect it does affect low-income families and residents more than others. Next slide, please. Okay, so we will now talk about climate change impact statements. So ICLEI began by looking at global and national climate change models based on several different emission scenarios to paint a picture of a full range of what could be possible for Hamilton's climate for the rest of this century. Looking at temperature, agricultural indices, precipitation, lake temperature and level, and extreme temperature, and used this information to create over 70 climate change impact statements. An impact statement is a description of how a change to the climate will affect a person, a resident, a business, etc. So in the case of flooding, if a change to the climate is that we're expecting to see more precipitation, then a climate change impact statement could be, again, about basement flooding. Next slide, please. These 70-plus corporate and climate community impact statements then underwent a vulnerability and risk assessment. Vulnerability is a combination of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So if you have a basement, you're more sensitive to a basement flood, of course. And if you have flooding or insurance, or if you have savings or insurance, then your adaptive capacity would be higher in the event of a basement flood. Risk is a combination of likelihood and consequences. Likelihood is largely determined by the scientific models, and consequences, again, depends on who you are. So if you have an empty, unfinished basement that nobody uses, then the impacts, the consequences of a basement flood for you would be very different than if you are a low-income tenant of a basement apartment. That vulnerability and risk assessment for both internal and external stakeholders resulted in 13 priority climate change impacts that were of most concern, both internally and externally. Next slide, please. Okay, and I will go through these fairly quickly. So flooding was one concern, of course. We have two impacts related to flooding, both due to increased frequency and increased intensity of precipitation events. Next slide, please. Extreme heat is next. Extreme heat is the one impact that was mentioned by every community organization I spoke to. It was certainly the most concerning impact for most of them. And as a result, we have 4 climate impact statements that relate to extreme heat, reflecting both health and safety, direct health and safety impacts of extreme heat events, as well as economic impacts for, say, increased use of air conditioning during these events. Next slide. We had 2 other health and safety impact statements as well, one speaking to direct health and safety impacts, again, resulting from extreme weather events such as ice storms leading to traffic accidents, and one dealing with the increase in infectious and vector-borne diseases as a result of longer and warmer summers. Next slide. Water quality was also a concern. As precipitation increases, runoff also increases, and runoff from roads, parking lots, farm fields, and lawns tends to contain a lot of chemicals, and these chemicals end up in our water bodies. So that is a concern. Next slide. Erosion and infrastructure damage. Increases in precipitation can result in erosion. For example, as we've seen along the lake waterfront and on our escarpment, leading to issues with escarpment access roads, and that kind of infrastructure repair can be quite expensive. Power outages are also a concern. We have seen power outages resulting, for example, from ice storms in the past relating to climate change. And some people who are more dependent on consistent power supplies will be more affected than others. And next slide. Last but not least, food insecurity. Not just resulting from decreases in agricultural yields for local farms, although that is a concern, but also increases in the prices of imported foods as climate change affects the global regions where we import most of our foods from. Next slide. So with our internal and external stakeholders again, we looked at those impact statements as well as best practices from all kinds of adaptation plans throughout the country to look at over 130 adaptive actions that could be taken to protect people from those impacts. Those were then condensed. We looked for areas of overlap, repetition, and anything that the city had already prioritized through an outstanding work item or budget we decided was already underway and we wouldn't worry about prioritizing it again. We ended up with 27 adaptive actions that were assigned to one of these 4 themes and 11 objectives under those themes. Built environment and systems, people and health, natural environment, agriculture and water, energy and economy. Next slide. Okay. So the action prioritization exercise resulted in 3 different levels of priority: priority 1, 2, and 3. Priority 1 is short-term, priority 2 is medium-term, and priority 3 is long-term. They don't necessarily reflect importance, although urgency was certainly a consideration in developing the action prioritization. In some cases, it also affects or reflects things like how feasible it is to move on it quickly, and how many organizations in the community felt prepared to pitch in. Next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of the actions in a lot of detail. I will go through them in priority order and comment on anything that I think deserves extra attention. So this slide shows our priority 1 actions. The first one, establish buddy systems or help your neighbor programs to implement during extreme weather events, was the one rated most urgent and important both internally and externally, so it is at the top of the list. But there's a number of other important actions here as well. Of course, we're looking at how we can change our residential buildings to be better equipped for climate impacts in the future, how we can make winter travel safer, especially for those who primarily use sidewalks, how we can communicate with the public about the risks associated with climate change, and how we can better equip people to deal with extreme heat in the future and growing more food locally. Next slide. Now we're getting into our priority 2 or medium-term actions. Again, there's a number of actions here that relate directly to the kinds of equity impact or input that we received from our consultation. So looking at supporting vulnerable persons in the community in coping with climate change, for example, during evacuations, if there were some, how could we make sure that they're appropriately supported? Protecting them from climate impacts, including extreme cold and extreme heat, as well as linking climate adaptation to affordable housing more generally. As I'm sure you can all imagine, someone without a house is more exposed to climate impacts of all kinds than someone indoors. So a first-line climate adaptation action is making sure that everyone has a place to call home. This is obviously not something that's going to happen quickly, but we do want to make it a priority to move forward and make sure that those connections are strengthened over time. Next slide. This is our second slide of medium-term actions, where we're looking at making sure everyone can access emergency preparedness kits, updating our municipal plans and policies, better protecting existing and new natural areas, both to protect biodiversity, to protect ground and surface water, as we spoke to that being a priority climate impact, as well as to absorb storms. When we get to extreme precipitation, green areas do absorb that water better than hard areas for runoff. And continuing to engage in tree planting. And this is one of the areas where the adaptation plan links up with the energy and emissions plan that Christine was talking about. Next slide. All right, these are the last of our medium-term adaptation actions. Again, we're linking this up with the community energy and emissions plan through the urban forest strategy and developing and protecting our urban forest. We also want to look at food insecurity actions here by better supporting our local agricultural leaders in adapting to climate change, and looking at ways to divert and repurpose excess food, as well as looking at the resilience or the resilience of our local energy system and the grid to reduce the likelihood of power outages over time. Next slide. Now we're getting into our long-term actions, where we are looking at updating our information about flooding risks throughout the city, looking at protecting people from vector-borne diseases, addressing excessive indoor temperatures in rental housing, and looking at how we can better manage our open space in the city. This is one of those areas where you can have a little bit of tension in that we want to protect people from vectors, which tend to live more in naturalized areas, but we also need to have more naturalized spaces to improve resilience to things like floods. So we want to make sure that our plans and policies as a city balance that tension and both encourage the naturalized spaces we need, as well as continuing to protect people from vector-borne diseases. Next slide. Here we're looking again at long-term actions where we want to monitor and notify people about flooding and extreme weather and temperature events, and look at improving that. Look at low carbon backup power systems in city facilities to be community hubs during emergencies, and also look at whether or not we can encourage and support the adoption of low or no carbon emergency energy supplies for residents and businesses, particularly those who, again, really depend on consistent energy supply. Develop low impact development and green infrastructure into new development, and look at supporting our local businesses so that they can maintain their operations during climate events as well. And that brings me to the end of the adaptive actions, and I'm going to, oh no, wait, is there one more slide, Trevor? I can't tell. My papers are stuck together.
We're now at the live poll.
Great, we're now at the live poll. Okay,
Great,
and
Andrea,
I'm going to pass it back to Trevor because I can't see the screen.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very clear. So again, we have a question for you. I'm wondering if we could put that full screen so we can all see it.
I'm going to have to close my screen actually to get the question set up.
So we'll keep it there for a moment then.
Okay.
So can you go back onto Menti if you can. And the code is here, 12009750. And for those who can't get into Menti, it says which two actions, recognizing there were lots there that are lots of important ideas, which two actions are you most likely to undertake in your own life in the next 2 years to help yourself or others adapt to a changing climate? So if you're able to put that into the Q&A, that would be great. So which two actions are you most likely to undertake in your own life?
So let me just, some patience and I'll get the question set up.
Perfect,
here.
thank you.
Oops.
So I think people are saying that the old question is still there, but it should come, the new question should come up in just a minute.
Yeah, there, it should be there. Is it there?
Yep. There, it is there. Yay, thanks. Someone writes. Thank you for that.
And now
so
I
the
have
new question is there.
And I have to share my screen again. There we go.
Great. So in the Q&A, someone writes that they would continue working with Hamilton 350 and elders for climate sanity, Another one writes, expanding gardens to share with food banks would be one of their top 2 things that they would be doing in the next 2 years. And if I squint really closely, I'm seeing home retrofit, food sump pump. I think it's sort of collecting things together. Another group is saying participate in community gardens or other urban agriculture. That's about 8%. 30% are saying help with community naturalization or tree planting. I see the numbers are fluctuating, so that's good as more people answer it. Joining in neighborhood support networking programs, about 28%. 4% so far saying volunteering in community housing projects. I'll just see what else is in the chat or the Q&A. Someone writes home retrofit. Another one says that they would potentially be replacing their furnace with a heat pump when furnace is done, and also planting trees in the land that they tend and planting pollinator flowers and shrubs. Another one says +1 on heat pumps. Another says tree planting. So that's great. And we will share these as part of the feedback report as well, in terms of what people feel that they can themselves really move forward on.
Okay, I'll give I'll do one other 1 minute countdown if people,
Okay.
they were given an option to choose 2 of them.
Yeah.
So if people, they put 1 in and want to add another one in, go ahead.
Okay. And in the Q&A, I've got high albedo, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong, high albedo colors for cars, roofs, etc. Albedo spelled A-L-B-E-D-O.
Albedo.
Albedo. Another writes the amount of energy reflected by the surface is called albedo. Thank you. Dark colors have an albedo close to 0, meaning little or no energy is reflected. Pale colors have an albedo close to 100%, meaning nearly all the energy is reflected. Learning new things every day, which is very exciting. Another writes that they would join and collaborate with community members to run mutual aid projects and help bring more environmental justice. Hoping to replace my gas furnace with a heat pump, another writes. So thank you, everyone, for those great contributions. Drive EV, continue to be child-free or car-free, and continue to support environmental groups are 3 other ideas that have just come up. So I think voting is closed on this.